Hello everyone, I welcome you all to the Interactive Film and Media Conference 2025. My paper builds on the topic of representation of reality and truth and analysis of media objectification at the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. I am Maruf Rahman, a Ph.D. candidate at 𝗪𝗘𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗔𝗟 School of Arts, Humanities and Technology at the University of Texas at Dallas. So my paper explores the contested concepts of truth and reality in documentary media by critically examining the theoretical perspectives and applying close reading analysis to a recent short documentary, namely Silent Suffering Inside the Rohingya Refugee Crisis. Beginning with a foundational definition by John Grierson, Bill Nichols, and Patricia Ovderhead, this paper traces how notions of actuality, indexicality, and ethical representation are embedded within the genre's form and purpose. Drawing on the scholarship of Philip Rosen, Michael Renov, and 𝗔𝗏𝗏, this study interrogates the idea that documentaries can offer unmediated access to truth or reality and instead argues for a more nuanced, reflexive understanding of representation. As a case study, this paper analyzes silent suffering inside the Rohingya refugee crisis, uh, published on YouTube in the year 2024, produced by EU Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid, and it was selected through purposive sampling for its narrative clarity and visual accessibility. Through a close reading of its imagery, structure, and portrayal of Rohingya women and children, this paper contends that documentary, while ostensibly humanitarian, reproduces objectifying tropes that dehumanize its subjects. Ultimately, this analysis calls for ethical documentary practices that critically engage with representation, voice, power, and in the depiction of displaced population. So this paper builds on the existing literature of Philip Rosen, Michael Renov, and 𝗔𝗏𝗏, and explores how they deals with the concepts of truth and reality. Before this paper dives into exploring the concept of truth and reality in documentary, it talks about what is documentary. It starts with definition of documentary to portray how the definition itself brings the concept of truth and reality. Many people define documentary form from their perspectives, but this response cites the reference to John Grierson, who coined the term documentary. In the year 1926, Grierson used this term by applying it to the film Moana uh, uh, by Robert Flaherty, and Moana, which was published in the year 1926, is a film that portrays the daily life on a South Seas island. Grierson defines documentary as the creative treatment of actuality, and in this definition of Grierson, he talks about the creative treatment and actuality, which provides the platform to think about truth and reality by the word actuality. Additionally, Bill Nichols provides his views on documentary, which also provides an opportunity to examine the concept of truth and reality in documentary. Nichols asserts that documentary deals with reality and focuses on something that happened, and it represents the real people instead of portraying the actors, and it tells the stories of the real world. Some other scholars bring the concept of truth and reality in their definitions, such as, according to Patricia Ovderhead, a documentary is a movie which is a portrait of real life and uses real life as the raw material, and in the making of a documentary, the artist and technicians decide what story they will tell, who will be the audience of the documentary, and what will be the purpose of the documentary. Additionally, Ovderhead says that the documentary can have multiple forms and faces. For example, she claims that a documentary can portray exotic lands and lifestyles by referencing Nanook of the North, or it can represent a visual poem which is depicted in Ivan's reigns. So I'm now directing towards the scholarship of Philip Rosen to explore how he deals with the idea of truth and reality. So, in exploring how documentary constructs truth and reality, when I was observing Philip Rosen's scholarship, I find that he analyzes his analysis of the 1963 JFK assassination coverage by NBC. Rosen points out that despite public desire for a real time account, NBC lacked the portable technology to capture live footage. and the anchors read wire updates and speculated, so there was no visual indexicality to anchor the truth. However, Rosen notes that the use of indexical media like photographs of Kennedy in Dallas or audio from eyewitnesses, and this offer fragments of reality but are not enough. This is where Bill Ryan, the NBC anchor, becomes essential. His live commentary filled in for missing visuals, connecting audiences to a chaotic moment, and Rosen calls this kind of narrational role vital in shaping perceived truth, especially when raw footage is absent or unclear. Later, in the documentary JFK, A Time Remembered, which was published in the year 1988, filmmaker Mark Overhouse stitches together multiple forms such as eyewitnesses, interviews, archival footage, and edited NBC segments, and the jerky footage is even emphasized to convey the suddenness of the tragedy. And Rosen argues that such post production construction, while edited, paradoxically surpasses the original broadcast in conveying reality. And Rosen then draws on John Grierson, who defined documentary as a creative treatment of actuality, suggesting that truth is not raw, rather it is crafted. This leads us to Michael Reynolds, who insists that even nonfiction employs fictive, poetic, and persuasive devices. And so when to further explore the complexities of truth and reality in documentary, I turn to Michael Reynolds, whose work dismantles the notion that nonfiction films offer objective accounts of the world. Reynolds claims that even so-called factual documentaries include fictive elements such as poetic narration, stylized visuals, and emotional build-up that designed to construct reality, not only just record it. He illustrates this with Nanook of the North, where the filmmaker constructs a larger than life hero figure, which is Nanook, and rather than documenting Inuit life objectively. But Renov goes further, showing how spectators also shape truth. Consider the roadnecking video. It was shot by a bystander and seemed like damning evidence of police brutality. Yet in court, defense attorneys reframed the same footage, slowing it down, shifting the focal point to support a completely opposite narrative. And the jurors' racial identity and ideological standpoint further influence their interpretation. And Renov argues this show that indexical footage doesn't equal truth, and interpretation mediates meaning. So he then identifies four key tendencies in documentary, which are to record, to persuade, to analyze, and to express. So by the term to record, he mentions that 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 un, that a documentary is never neutral. For example, Jonas Mekas adds voiceover to street scenes, reshaping memory and meaning. And as an example of to persuade, as in the and documentary Why We Fight or Night and Fog, where documentaries push political or emotional agendas, and regarding to analyze by encouraging critical interrogation. Films like an accompaniment for cinematographic cinemax, disparate elements, music, archives, war footage to provoke thought and to express that Grierson called it the creative treatment of actuality, where enough emphasizes that artistic form and poetic language are crucial to how truth is felt and understood. So now at this point, we are moving towards the anthropological documentary, and we are exploring the concept of anthropological documentary and the perspective of truth and reality through the scholarship of 𝗔𝗠𝗏. So to further explore how documentary films represent truth and reality, 𝗔𝗠𝗏, whose work powerfully deconstructs the politics of image making in nonfiction. Minha begins by calling attention to a factor often overlooked in traditional discussions of representation, which is money, and she argues that the budget of a film deeply influences the credibility of its truth. A high budget film is often seen as more professional, more trustworthy, but what happens when financial power determines which truths are visible? So Minha warns that truth becomes standardized, sanitized through better image quality, clearer sound, and cleaner edits, and all dictated by access to resources. So, uh, uh, Trinmin's sharpest critique is reserved for anthropological filmmaking. Although ethnographic documentaries are often thought to capture the natural world, Minha insists they are shaped by scientific methods and institutional authority. The so-called objectivity of anthropology, she argues, it is the voice of local or amateur ethnographers in favor of a Western, often paternalistic lens. So, to counter this, Minha proposes a self reflexive documentary practice, one that reveals its own process, acknowledges its biases, and opens up the interpretation of its subjects. Reflexivity, she argues, should not validate an anthropologist's perspectives, but instead leave space for viewers to interpret meaning based on their own embodied experiences. So this paper considers the documentary reassemblage because in terms of representing truth and reality, this documentary provides a framework to understand how Trinh Minh Ha clarifies her stance on how impossible it is to document the truth and reality in documentary. In addition, this paper thinks that reassembling is one of the best practices because Trinh Minh Ha, through this documentary, questions the claim of truth and reality presented in anthropological documentaries and shows an alternative way of documenting. For example, Reassemblage starts with an almost 1 minute black scene without showing any visual subject, and just by incorporating audio of the place, Senegal in the year 1981. The audio does not provide any concrete sound but disseminates a sense of happening which contains the beats of music and undecipherable voice of people. Even when the documentary starts showing visual subjects, it shows fragmented scenes of men and women engaging in their regular activities, uh, children standing, and a close up shot of one old man for around 20 seconds without any commentary. So, Trimin after 20 seconds of showing the fragmented visual evidence, Minha starts by commentary, where she says that she does not intend to speak about, just speak nearby. And regarding this comment, in an interview with Erika Belsom, sorry for the interruption. So, uh, regarding this comment in an interview with Erika Balsam, Minha clarifies that by speak nearby, she acknowledges that she is committed to not speak on the behalf of people and about their place, and she thinks that this approach frees from the position of authority and hierarchy of knowledge. And this example clarifies how Trinh Minh Ha rejects the anthropological notion of truth, where the anthropologist provides direct information and voiceover to rationalize their claim, and how she avoids describing what she documents with her camera. Thus, this answer thinks that without direct intervention in the activity of the people is one of the best practices that attend to expectation of truth and reality, which challenges the traditional anthropological notion of documentary. So, reassemblage also collects footage but breaks the assumption that the footage and indexicality of the anthropological documentary carry truth and reality. For example, in the case of assassination footage of President John F. Kennedy, which is a linear video footage, the news anchor presented only what he had in his hand in a coherent way. But in the case of reassemblage, Minha also put voiceover and editing but presented everything in a fragmented fashion, which disrupts the expectation of the audiences that documentary should present truth and reality in an organized manner. For example, Minha shows an old man sewing something from the fiber or of a plant without any commentary on what the old man is doing, and she showed this activity of the old man in multiple shots, such as sometimes by close shots, sometimes by full shots, but all in a fragmented fashion. So therefore, this response seeks that this I mean this paper thinks that this documentary is a good practice that Trinh Minh Ha adopts to challenge the expectation of truth and reality in documentary. While this study analyzes the aspects of truth and reality in documentary from the lens of multiple scholars and practices, it closely reads the documentary Silent Suffering Inside the Rohingya Refugee Crisis that reinforces objectifying narratives, particularly through its depiction of Rohingya women and infants. Female subjects are frequently shown in highly vulnerable states, either silently cradling children, sitting in makeshift shelters, or walking through the flood prone areas without accompanying personal narratives or contextual details. This visual strategy portrays women primarily as a caretakers or victims, reducing them to symbols of suffering rather than recognizing them as complex individuals with voices, agency, and diverse roles within their communities. And infants, often filmed in close up with visible signs of malnutrition or distress, serve as emotional triggers, eliciting sympathy but rarely framed in ways that emphasize the structural condition causing their hardship. After critical analysis of this documentary, I find that the documentary Silent Suffering Inside the Rohingya Refugee Crisis focuses explicitly on women, and this documentary disseminates a sense of fear, horror, and sourness. This documentary demonstrates the visibility of infants, toddlers, and women, which I think is problematic by observing them from the theoretical framework of Harsh. Moreover, I argue that although the director and the producer are not the perpetrator of the genocide, they unknowingly serve the purpose of the victors of this genocide because this type of documentary deviates the audience from the underlying politics of the genocide by generalizing the sorrows of the victims. In addition, I claim that this documentary has the potential to be reproduced and reused in future when the post generation of the genocide will face trouble remember the actual horror and trauma of the genocide. The reproduction and reuse of the genocide video hide the original meaning and resources of the devastating story, but how the deviation happens is explained by Harsh by the concept of infantilization, feminization, or universalization mechanism in photos, and by portraying the perpetrators as hypermasculine or depersonalizing the character of the perpetrators. As this paper observes the gender dimension of the victim representation in the Rohingya genocide in documentary, it cites Harsh, who provides an example of Judy Chicago's Holocaust project to illustrate the gender dimension of the photograph. Harsh shows that the title of the panel is Imbalance Power, where the same photo of the Warsaw boy of the Holocaust is used and placed in the middle of the panel with other photos. This image is edited and placed with a painted figure of a Nazi soldier who pointing his gun toward the boy. And by providing this example of the photo, Harsh claims that this photo of the victim is infantilized, where the drawn figure of the Nazi soldier is hypermasculinized, which represents the phallic and mechanized version of the evil. Besides, Harsh argues that although Chicago attempts to raise awareness about the powerlessness of the victim, she situates the viewers of the position of the victim who is both feminized and infantilized. In doing so, Harsh claims that Chicago erases the individual agency of the soldier and depersonalizes the perpetrator by showing him as a hypermasculine form. Thus, Harsh believes that this representation is problematic because it decontextualizes the act of the perpetrators by showing them as a non-human and connects the viewers entirely with the boy with a feminized and infantilized version of the boy, which creates obstacles to remembering the real horror of the genocide and the criminality of the perpetrators. This discussion of Harsh provides a theoretical framework to analyze the documentary Silent Suffering Inside Rohingya Refugee Crisis and supports the claim of the paper that similar to the representation of the Warsaw Boy of the Holocaust, the victims of the Rohingya genocide are also in many cases feminized and infantilized, which deviates our focus in remembering the victims and their embodied experience of the genocide. Uh, so, while this paper agrees with the notion that the past is represented by the victors, and it also inclines with the aspects of the victors who are representing the victims of the erase the victims' existence perpetuates to the people who are not the victors but in the position of the authority and the intellectual positions. They follow the perpetrator's mechanism of representation. To echo this claim, this study cites Stone, who analyzes two Sonar Commando photographs which were taken by the prisoners of the camp, and he claimed that the Auschwitz Museum displays this photo only to shock the viewers. He also argues that the museum does not provide any commentary or historical references to those photos, which is similar to the form of pornography of the violence, which means only to arouse an instant sensation of shock after watching the photo, but not thinking deeply without the underlying factor that led the genocide and Holocaust memory. Similarly, Harsh argues that one of the problematic representation of the genocide is that it universalizes the true victim, such as by closing up the innocent child or focusing on women by engendering a false sense of intimacy, which disables the viewers to understand the underlying factors and historical specificity of genocide. So similarly, silent suffering inside the Rohingya refugee crisis engenders a sense of emotional excitement that hides the trauma, horror, and suffering of the genocide. Therefore, this paper states that the mechanism of victors' representation of genocide becomes so internalized in the post generation that they either knowingly or unknowingly follow the perpetrator's mechanism, which eventually serves the purpose of the victors. So this is the end of my presentation. To so Here you can see that the point I have told is in a is enlisted. So if you have any more question, I can be reached at the following email address. Thank you very much for listening to this entire paper. But if you have any question, you can let me know also to my email address. Thank you very much.